Hi everyone, this is Dr. Maples. We're picking up our ethics lecture, our third lecture series, talking a little bit about doing ethical research. Now, do remember as part of this, you'll be completing the CITI training. There'll be a handout on Blackboard about that. There'll also be information in the previous lecture about that. And of course, if you have any questions at all, you'll be able to contact me and we'll work that out. I want to talk about some of the basics of ethical research, some of the things that are the most important applicable ideas that we make sure our students are thinking about going into this. Now, I will say that by and far, sociological studies are pretty mundane and uninteresting and aren't going to harm people. The biggest thing is making sure that people have consented to participate in the study and that they don't feel forced, and that we protect everyone who's involved in the study by giving them anonymity is the most ideal opportunity. That said, there are occasionally cases, which we'll talk about on our next slide, where the studies are maybe more in depth, or they approach ideas that could impact people, or they look at particular groups that could more easily be compelled or forced or even harmed as participating because of participating in the study. So let's start with what we mean by informed consent. Anyone involved has to give informed consent. Now, informed consent is the idea that the person who you have asked to participate in your study fully consents to participate in this study without any reservations, without any sense of being compelled to do this, and that they understand the risks of the study, they understand what you're going to do with the study and what you're going to do with the data, they understand any benefits they may receive from the study, such as being induced to take the study by giving them a $25 Amazon card, for example. But they understand fully what you plan to do with the data. They also understand too, and this is very important, that they're not being forced to participate. This is the idea of informed consent. Now, there are instances where people have to have others give informed consent for them as well. So, for example, we'll learn that if we are studying minors, not like coal miners, but minors in like a high school or an elementary school, their parents have to consent because they're not 18 years old. We have to make sure that there's someone who can consent for them to participate in the study. They also would consent because their parents can't force them, but we also have to have their parents consent. Now, there are some studies, and these are uncommon exceptions, where anonymous observations of public activities don't require IRB. If you're not interacting with someone, if you're not communicating with anyone, and you are basically not obstructing anything, being a people watcher isn't necessarily subject to IRB. It's a good idea to still run it through IRB, but it's not necessarily subjected to it. There are also interviews are not always subjected to IRB. For example, if you're doing an oral history collection, oral history collections are handled a little bit differently by IRB, and so they often will go through like an oral history commission or something like that to get approval, which is much easier as opposed to going through the IRB process. So again, the critical thing that you always want to make sure is that you're not forcing people to take a study. Some examples of forcing people to take a study would be, let's pretend you're a police officer doing a study and you want to study criminal activity, and you arrest someone, and then you tell them, well, hey, I won't arrest you if you'll take this survey or if you'll participate in this study. That's not right. You can't do that. You can't do that. Likewise, as a professor, I can't create a study and then tell you you have to take it for points. I can give you extra credit to take it. That's what we call an inducement. But I can't say you have to participate in this survey whether you want to or not, and you're going to get points for it. Can't do that. So we have to make sure that the people who are involved are doing so because they want to be involved. The cool thing is people often enjoy being part of research. They like the idea that they're part of something bigger. I've often found with outdoor recreation communities, they love being studied. And so it's not a big issue. And for the bulk of studies that you're going to have out there, they're not studying things that are frightening, concerning, going to cause harm. They're often, to many people, quite mundane or boring or plain, but they're very exciting to us as sociologists. Next thing, and this is a big one, I want to make sure that you understand that we always, always, always have to protect the identities of people who participate in our surveys, studies, anything. We always want to do one of two things. Now, if we do collect names, we have to make sure and remove those from the data set, and we want to make sure that they are cleaned and there's no risk of those names getting out. We want to clean any personal identifiers like email addresses, names, addresses, phone numbers, contact information, any of that stuff. We need to clean that. What we want to do is get the data set so that it is at such a point that we couldn't determine anyone's identity based on the data that we have available. That means that the data set is clean and that you can use it. Doesn't mean that you can share it with anyone, by the way. Unless they're part of the IRB, you can't share the data set. So for example, if you did a study in your senior thesis and one of your friends was like, hey, I'm going to do a senior thesis, can I use your data set? The answer is no, you may not. Now we can work with IRB so that they have access to that data set, but you can't just give it to them. Instead, in fact, you have a responsibility to protect that data set. Likewise, we want to make sure we protect the identities of the people involved. The easiest thing is to don't collect any personal identifiers. Keep it completely anonymous. If it's completely anonymous, you can never have an issue over someone's identity being detected through the data. That's really the easiest way, is to not collect anything personal. Just keep it very vague and big, like, their responses to a series of questions that don't have anything to do with their identities. But simply put, you'll never, ever divulge who participated in a study. It's just not going to happen. Now, there are cases where their identities will be known, and there are varying levels of the study that allow for that, and IRB can improve that process. Oral histories are another good example of that. All my oral history interviews, except if they request otherwise, have a name attached to them. But that's part of the oral history tradition. It's accepted practice. For IRB, I would not publish the data and say that, Jim Smith, who lives at such and such street in such and such city, said blah, 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 blah in the analyses of my studies. I would never divulge their information. Got to make sure we protect that, even from accidental releases. And that's the scary thing, is accidents happen. You attach the wrong data set because you mislabeled it and you share it with the world. But once that data is out there, it's out there. So we got to make sure that these things don't happen. One other example could be in a qualitative study where you're observing people, you're doing ethnographies, you're doing content analysis. You may know people's identities and you need to find ways to anonymize them in your analysis. And there's lots of different ways to do that, and we'll talk more about that when we learn about those different research methods. But the easiest one is to give them a pseudonym, where it's a different name that they made up or you made up. Now, these are just the basics. When you take this city course, you're going to learn a lot more history, but also detailed explanations about when and how we have to think about ethics in our studies. I want to give you one other thing that the IRBs are thinking about. And again, almost all studies in sociology, I find, fall in this first category, and that's what we call exempt. Now, when you apply for Institutional Review Board, you'll have one of three options. You can apply to be an exempt study, an expedited study, or a full review study. Exempt means that your study is utterly boring, most likely anonymous or can be made anonymous, and it doesn't involve any high-risk populations. This describes all of my research. In fact, to date, I think I only have 2 instances where I've requested IRBs that are expedited, and that's because that there were some identities in there, or maybe they dealt with a protected group. Now, with an exempt study, we go through the process of making sure that if we do collect data about their identities, we would scrub that from the data set, or more preferably just don't collect it to begin with, because you probably don't need their names and emails and all those other things. And that we don't study high-risk populations. Now, at-risk populations per IRB includes prisoners, children, and pregnant persons. These are people who could be swayed or maybe compelled to take a study, or in the case of pregnant persons, there's a couple of different reasons. This is maybe a group that medically you have more things that you have to think about because you have 2 potential lives at hand. in the study, but also there's just a sense of consent that has to be given. So keep that in mind. An exempt study does not include prisoners, children, and children's defined as under age 18 or pregnant persons in their study. And they're mundane, and they're often anonymous. And I'll tell you, these IRBs, they go in 1 week, and they come out the next week 90% of the time, and there's no problems. Now, an expedited review means that you're probably having no greater than minimal risk, but you're still looking at a protected group. If you're studying prisoners, children, or pregnant persons, we have extra steps that we have to go through to make sure they aren't being compelled, that they aren't being forced into the study, or being put in a situation that they can only choose to be in the study, such as, contacting homeless persons and offering them money to participate in a study, or economically disadvantaged people and offering them money to participate in a study. We have to make sure that these people are protected. Right now, I'm working on a study in Wolfe County, and I'm looking at students. So I'll have to make sure that I have to get their parents' permission. That's a boring study. I'm understanding what might keep them in Wolfe County after graduation is what I'm going to study. But it's boring, but because it deals with of minors, it deals with people under the age of 18, I have to get additional review, and I also have to get additional approval from their parents. Full review is where you have something that is dangerous to the people involved, that it's greater than minimal chance that the persons involved could be impacted by the study. This can also include still working with protected groups. These are situations where the questions you ask or the ideas you're studying or the data that you're collecting, if it ever became public, could ruin people, or that you're giving them some kind of experimental thing that could very, very likely injure them. Full reviews require a long time, where exempt ones go in 1 week and usually come out the next. Expedited can take maybe a few extra weeks, and a full review only happens a couple times a year. As an undergraduate researcher, you're not going to be doing a full review study. It's just simply not going to happen. That's reserved for PhDs. And it's very unlikely that as a faculty mentor, you're going to find someone approved for an expedited review. Instead, for your senior theses and for any project that you would do as an EKU student, you're going to be doing exempt work. Now, again, you're going to be learning a whole bunch more about ethics by taking that CITI course. But remember, society is where we do our studies. Society is our lab. We have to take care of our lab. We have a moral responsibility and a legal responsibility as well to take care of the people that we're studying. We have to make sure they are not injured. Think about this in terms of a golden rule. You treat others as you would expect to be treated. That's what we want to do here. If I'm going to participate in a study, I want to know that I'm protected as an individual, that my data are not going to be released to the public, that nothing that could impact me is going to happen as part of a study. Keep these things in mind as you start thinking of projects that you might want to look at when your theses come up next year. Likewise, we'll have a chance to think about these questions a bit more later in the semester when you get to practice 2 different kinds of methods that you choose. We'll talk more about this. If you have questions in the meantime, you know where to find me. Likewise, if you need anything as you get registered for those CITI courses and begin taking them, just let me know. Again, I'm here to help. Talk soon. See ya.